Facing years in prison for alleged crimes described by many as trivial. What does the US government's relentless pursuit of internet whistleblowers tell us about the priorities of President Obama's Department of Justice? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. The US Department of Justice is under increasing scrutiny over its unwavering determination to prosecute internet journalists and activists, especially those who challenge what appears to be the abuse of power by government and corporations. The latest example involves the sentencing of a 26-year-old to 3.5 years in prison for obtaining the personal data of thousands of AT&T's customers. But supporters of Andrew Auernheimer argue he was exposing a flaw in the firm's security system that had already endangered the personal information of customers, and he did no actual hacking himself. Then there's the pending prosecution of the journalist Barret Brown, who potentially faces decades in prison. His supporters say it was his work investigating the largely secret relationships and tactics of security contractors, corporations, and the government that led President Obama's Department of Justice to targeting him for prosecution. Campaigners say the DOJ and the US Attorney General Eric Holder have not learned the lessons of the suicide of another internet activist, Aaron Swartz, in January of this year. Swartz's family said his death was, quote, the product of a criminal justice system rife with intimidation and prosecutorial overreach. So why is the Department of Justice so relentless in its pursuit of internet activists and shrugging off notions of the public interest in favor of recommending sentences that far outweigh any crime committed? Joining me now are from Rio de Janeiro, Glenn Greenwald, a constitutional lawyer and columnist for the Guardian newspaper. From New York, Christian Stork, who's written extensively on the Barret Brown case for the investigative journalism site Who, What, Why. And Kevin Gallagher, founder of the Barret Brown Legal Defense Fund. He joins us from Springfield, Massachusetts. Kevin, first of all then, before we try and understand a little bit more about who Barret Brown is, how long has he now been in prison and what sort of sentence is he facing?
Right, well, Barret Brown has been in prison for the last 6 months, since September 12th, and he's currently facing 105 years total if you count the 17 counts that have been filed in 3 indictments against him.
All right, well, let's begin at the beginning then. Kevin Gallagher, who is Barret Brown, and what was his focus as an investigative journalist?
Barret Brown was a freelance journalist who around 2010 became very interested in the group Anonymous. He kind of saw the phenomenon of hacktivism as a powerful new thing that could level the balance of power and actually affect change in the world. So there was a series of hacks which Anonymous engaged in. One of them involved the security firm HB Gary, in which emails were obtained by the hackers. And Barret Brown had a group called Project PM who were involved in going through these emails to basically see what these firms were up to. And he was responsible for finding out a number of things and then informing the public and the media about them. All
right, well, let's unpick that a little bit more. Christian Stork, though, first of all, Barret Brown himself wasn't a hacker, then?
No, he wasn't. In fact, many sources I've spoken to who are close to him have claimed that he does not have any of the skills required to be any sort of top-level hacker, whether in Anonymous or LulzSec or any other of these hacking factions. His work was solely premised on, as Kevin said, investigating these emails that were pilfered by the hackers, although he, and I believe the government has no charge to say otherwise, he certainly was not involved in the hacking itself, in the actual breach of the data.
All right, and Christian, who exactly is HB Gary, the security firm that was hacked?
Sure, HB Gary is a private security, specifically a computer security firm that was started in 2003, and they developed a subsidiary to handle all of the contracting work that they were getting with the federal government. That's known as HB Gary Federal. H.B. Gary Federal was run by a man named Aaron Barr. He was the CEO. That is the executive who in 2011 gave an interview to the Financial Times in which he said he planned to out several top members of Anonymous, and in response, Anonymous then decided to hack into H.B. Gary Federal servers and obtained all his emails. They then proceeded to dump all those emails into the public, and it was so vast a trove that not many could really figure where to start or what to do until eventually an arrangement between H.B. Gary Federal and two other cybersecurity firms was discovered, in which the three were planning several odious activities. Some of them, there's a debate over whether or not it reached the level of illegality, but essentially that's what Barret Brown himself was investigating in his research effort known as Project PM.
Well, let's be a bit more specific about what was inside all those emails and those documents. Glenn Greenwald, what was discovered by this dump?
The most significant discoveries involved a proposal between H.B. Gary Federal, as Christian said, and two other firms, Palantir and Barrett, that intended to attract the business of Bank of America and their very well-connected Washington law firm, Hunton & Williams. And these proposals were intended to persuade the Bank of America and Hunton & Williams that they should hire this triumvirate of firms in order to basically do the dirty work of the Bank of America and another client of Hunton & Williams is the Chamber of Commerce, the very large and influential pro-business advocacy group. And one of the things that was proposed by H.B. Gary Federal and other people at these various firms participated in the discussion was to target various journalists and activists who were either adverse to the Bank of America or who were adverse to the Chamber of Commerce. And at the time, the Bank of America was very worried because news reports had said that WikiLeaks was sitting on a huge dump of documents that showed all kinds of high-level fraud and other wrongdoing at Bank of America. And it was well known that Bank of America wanted to attack WikiLeaks. And so what these firms did was they said, we will target people who are important to the defense of WikiLeaks and basically threatened to destroy their careers unless they stop defending WikiLeaks. And one of the reasons why I became quite interested in that story was because I was one of the people discussed in these proposals among H.B. Gary and these other firms as somebody whose career ought to be targeted and threatened with destruction if I didn't stop advocating on behalf of WikiLeaks. And it was really Barret Brown who became the spearhead as a journalist in digging through these documents and trying to make the connections and the patterns and finding out more about this very shadowy but significant world of private intelligence and national security contractors like these firms and their relationship to the federal government, the national security state, and the world of surveillance.
What was Bank of America and the Chamber of Commerce, which of course represents so many of the US's corporate interests, what was their role in all this? Were they simply just, being presented with this information, or were they actively trying to get someone to do this?
Yeah, I believe that, as Glenn indicated, that all of this effort was channeled through Hunton & Williams. Now that provides Bank of America and the other clients in question a degree of plausible deniability, and so it's really up in the air whether or not executives at Bank of America knew.
Which is the sort of thing which makes one wonder why there isn't an investigation then into this. There is this debate as to whether there's any criminality involved. Glenn Greenwald, but as far as we can tell, though, the Department of Justice hasn't opened an investigation into the allegations and the suggestions of criminality that we discovered through the H.B. Gary leak.
Yeah, I think that's the critical point. I mean, Hunton & Williams is a very well-connected firm in Washington. They have several partners who have been high-placed officials in the U.S. government. They do all kinds of work with the U.S. government, and this really gets to the underlying point at stake in all of these cases, which is, as long as criminality is done on behalf of the interest of the U.S. government or to advance the interest of large corporations, then there's no interest whatsoever in prosecuting it, investigating it, or punishing it. I mean, the criminality or potential criminality exposed by these emails is far greater than anything done by any of the hackers who have been targeted by the US government, and yet there's no interest in doing anything about it because these are people who are essentially on the side of the government. But the minute there's somebody whose political orientation is opposed to the government, when they commit even the most trivial transgressions of law at worst, and sometimes not even breaking the law, the full weight of the criminal justice system, the Department of Justice, comes crashing down upon them because the law is not being applied equally at all to punish wrongdoers regardless of their power, position, and prestige, which is what the rule of law is supposed to do. The law is being exploited as a means to entrench public and private sector power, and that's what makes all of this so warped and so menacing.
So, Christian Stork, then no investigation by the DOJ into H.B. Gary or the middlemen who were involved in all of this stuff. However, Barret Brown clearly has piqued the interest of the DOJ, and in March 2012, his house is raided. Under what authority? What did the search warrant say?
Sure. So that raid occurred after the Christmas Day hack of the private security or private intelligence firm known as Stratfor. That led to a huge effort by the DOJ to look into the hackers and to hacktivism in general. And in March 2012, the search warrant indicated that they were looking for documents or information related to not only the Stratfor leak, but also to several hacking entities such as LulzSec and Anonymous, as well as the entities which Barret Brown himself and Project PM were researching. Now, those, I think that serves as a clear indicator that the DOJ was interested in his work as a journalist much more than they were interested in his supposed transgressions, obviously, which don't even manifest until later on after the after the raid. So
after the raid, though, I mean, they find nothing.
Yeah.
And he is, though, I mean, it takes a little while longer, though, for him to be arrested, for Barret Brown to be arrested, but this time following a video that he posted on YouTube. What exactly was going on there?
Sure. So in September, he posts a video on YouTube in which he, probably in a very ill-advised and according to his own, according to him, he says he was under withdrawal from various medications that he was on, in which he more or less laments the sad position that he's come into, including the position of having his mother constantly threatened with being charged as an accessory or as aiding and abetting him. And in this video, he talks about how he wants to, quote-unquote, destroy the special agent in charge of the investigation for all the threats and the muscle that the DOJ is putting on him. So that's when he records the YouTube video explaining exactly what he wants to do. He clearly, in the video, does not advocate violence, although he uses some very, how should we say, some very ill-advised language in crafting his argument.
Kevin Gallagher, I mean, so that's the first indictment against him, then, threatening a federal officer, in effect. I mean, that's quite a serious charge, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it carries, many years potentially if he's convicted. But the idea that I think what's most disconcerting is the way that they continue to pile things on after that initial indictment.
Okay.
So that he's facing up to 100 years, and that's just outrageous.
Well, let's look at that the second indictment then is trafficking in stolen goods, Glenn Greenwald. Now, this seems to have a lot of legal implications, because the stolen goods in question appear to be information hacked by, another group, which he happened to be using for his journalism. Is that correct? Or, I mean, perhaps you can help us through that one, Glenn.
Yeah, this is really the crux now of the prosecution. I mean, the harassment charge is a serious charge, but nobody would ever go to prison for a YouTube video that clearly wasn't about physical violence. This is the crux of the case. As Christian said, the federal government is not claiming that Barrett participated in any of these hacks, that he helped to dig into somebody else's emails. What happened was that part of the Stratfor documents included a file that contained a whole bunch of information, including a list of the names of the clients of Stratfor, as well as their credit card information to pay the firm when it did intelligence work. And one day, Barrett was in a private chat room, and he posted a link to the file that contained the credit card information, the client names, and a whole bunch of other information. The government claims that simply by virtue of posting that link, he is now guilty of helping to essentially traffic in and disseminate stolen information, that some of those credit cards ultimately were used to make donations to charities by other people who weren't authorized to use them, and that by posting the link, he is now criminally responsible, up to decades in prison, for trafficking in stolen information. And what's so odious about that theory is that journalists all the time post to and link to documents that are quote unquote stolen. I mean, the New York Times almost every day links to or references documents that were leaked by Bradley Manning by his own admission without authorization and published by WikiLeaks. People write about the anonymous hacks and link to the information. There's all kinds of reasons that you would want to leak to the information. There's zero indication, the government's not claiming that Barret Brown profited from those credit cards, encouraged anybody to use it. It's really just a way of trying to concoct anything they can, throw anything they can together to threaten him with long-term imprisonment and to keep him in prison as punishment for his journalism, for digging into these areas that the federal government doesn't want people digging into.
Christian Stork, do you think the government really wants to lock him up for decades, or might this be more about trying to pressure him into giving up more information about Anonymous, who the government seems to be terribly concerned about right now?
I think that's exactly right. In fact, this seems pretty standard for the DOJ in order to, the ability to leverage these extremely long sentences into guilty pleas and to or into cooperation on the part of Barrett. Now, we saw this in the case of activist Aaron SWARTZ, where he was facing over 50 years behind bars for very minor transgressions as well. These sorts of, the ability of prosecutors to leverage extremely long sentences and more or less extort either guilty pleas and or cooperation out of the defendants is a problem that's certainly not confined to Barret Brown, but it was definitely the playbook used in his case.
By the way, Glenn, on as a legal matter, does the public interest come into this?
Well, journalists are bound by the law like anybody else, so you don't have license to break the law just because you're pursuing an important story or because you're an activist who's pursuing an important cause, but intent is crucial. So if you're posting links to people's credit card information because you're intending to encourage them to use those credit cards or enabling them to do so, then that could be criminal. But in the Barrett's case, he not only never did that, he actually publicly denounced the obtaining of the credit card information because he thought it was a distraction from their real mission. And so if he can demonstrate, which clearly seems to be the case, that his interest in these files was journalistic, that he was interested in the information contained in the files in order to dig into the world of private intelligence firms like Stratford and the nefarious conduct they engage in with the government, that would mean that he didn't have criminal intent to disseminate stolen information. He was simply acting as a journalist, as you said, in the public good, and doing what journalists do, which is dig into files that other people make accessible.
Christian, a lot of this seems to be bound up then in this concept of hacktivism, and the Department of Justice and the Obama administration seem very concerned about this. In fact, we did a show last week on the release of the 2013 Worldwide Threat Assessment Report, which is the sum of the 16 U.S. intelligence agencies' knowledge. And hacktivists were placed up there with Al-Qaeda in the list of enemies. I mean, how would you define hacktivism?
I mean, it has a wide array of definitions. I would say the cases which we've seen most currently is the ability to either steal or leak information that would otherwise be kept secret and disseminate it through the internet. And I find that that the government is extremely concerned about this development and the ability of the internet to disseminate information they don't want to disseminate. In the same way that any governments of the past were concerned about secret operations. This brings to mind the break-in by a left-wing group of an FBI office in Pennsylvania in the 1970s. Now, that was certainly an illegal act, but what came of it, what came out of that was essentially the COINTELPRO investigation, which is how many people know exactly the depths to which the CIA, FBI, other sort of intelligence agencies went to violate the rights of Americans and conduct extremely shady operations domestically. So I think that is the central thrust of the government's interest in hacktivism is the sheer ability to not only access information but to disseminate it as well.
So I suppose in some ways, Kevin, the growth in hacktivism is bound up not only with the growth of new technologies, but also growth in the level of secrecy in government operations under President Obama, and perhaps even, and indeed that the ferocity of the crackdown would probably be connected to that as well.
That's right. We've seen a massive increase in the size of the surveillance state. You have whistleblowers from the NSA, such as Thomas Drake, William Binney, saying that the government's now engaging in bulk interception, which means they just intercept all the communications, whether it's text, cell, email, what have you. So I think it's really a failure of the Obama administration and Holder's Justice Department that they're pursuing such draconic sentences against information freedom activists, because it just demonstrates that they really don't understand the internet. The internet is a sentient being in a way.
But is it that they don't understand, Glenn, or that they do understand, and that's why they're very happy to use these sorts of tools? Yeah. The other main issue, I suppose, is the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which has been used in other prosecutions, not in this one, not in Barret Brown's, which is based on rather nebulous notions of what authorized access is. I mean, we could all be perhaps prosecuted under that, perhaps, but Glenn, I mean, they do know what they're doing, don't they?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would disagree just very slightly with what Kevin said. I think they have a very good understanding of what the internet is, and especially what the potential of it is. Long has the internet been held up as an example of a weapon that can basically democratize political discourse, that can disperse political power, pose challenges to people who wield political power. The U.S. government actually views the internet as a weapon to use against other regimes that it dislikes, to empower people to challenge those regimes, but it also knows that the internet can be used against and to subvert power factions in the United States as well. And like any weapon that has ever been developed throughout American history or world history since the history of politics began, whenever there's a weapon like that that emerges, there's always a fight for control over who will get to use it, who will get to decide how it operates. And I think this is really what this is about, is trying to punish and deter in a very severe way anybody who would use the internet to meaningfully work against the power factions of the United States, its wall of secrecy behind which it operates, in order to deter this kind of activism and keep the internet under its control. Remember the last time I was here, I think the last show I did here was about the U.S. use of cyber warfare. The U.S. government wants to have a monopoly on being able to break into other people's computer security systems, use the internet to engage in cyber warfare, but it wants to make sure that nobody can use the internet to undermine its own authority and power. And I think that's really what this prosecution priority framework is all about.
But Christian, how often are tools like the CFAA or discussing information in terms of trafficking in stolen goods, or indeed aiding the enemy? I mean, how often are these cases coming up? I mean, we don't hear about very many of them.
Yeah, you're right. You don't hear about very many of them, but according to people who have connections to the Justice Department and follow this sorts of thing, it actually happens quite frequently. I know Glenn cited in his summary of Barret Brown's trials that Orrin Kerr, I believe is the name, of a former prosecutor and now a law professor at GW, who says that these sorts of prosecutions are extremely routine. It's not necessarily the willingness, or excuse me, it's not necessarily the government's ability to do these things. It's the willingness it's the latitude with which the CFAA and their interpretations of other laws allow them to basically go after people who they don't like. It doesn't necessarily mean they will. If you play ball and you're not a thorn in their side, I'm sure they wouldn't. But the latitude with which these laws are written and prosecutorial discretion allows them to go after the ones that they consider to be dangerous.
Kevin, we only have like 30 seconds here, but what is the timeline now of Barret Brown's case? How is he funding his defense? What happens from here?
Well, he has 2 trials which are scheduled for September, at which point he will have been in detention for 1 year. And we just think it's important that someone who's facing such an extreme sentence should have the resources that he needs in order to mount a robust defense. So, yes, we're raising funds, we're trying to raise public awareness, and we're trying to reform these laws.
Kevin Gallagher, thank you very much. Christian Stork, thank you. Glenn Greenwald, thanks very much to you. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.